Let me begin by introducing you to this woman. Her name is Elsie Johns. It is a name I'm sure most of you have never heard of before, but you should have. Elsie's is a story you should know, because Elsie Johns was one of the best United Methodist pastors the state of Michigan has ever seen. Reverend Elsie Johns served the Clarenceville United Methodist Church in Livonia from 1941 until her death in 1974. 33 years in one place. And here is what is remarkable about Elsie's story. Elsie was sent to the Clarenceville Church to close it. Because of the Depression, the church was in financial debt and had been placed in foreclosure. And then because of some struggles between the annual conference and the pastor, church politics, can you imagine? The members of the Clarenceville Church decided to leave the denomination and form their own independent church. That decision to leave the denomination meant they would have to leave their building. So can you imagine the dilemma? The denomination is now stuck with an empty building, with no income, and mounting debt. That's when the conference decided to send Elsie Johns, a laywoman from Highland Park, to steward over the property as they worked out a plan to close it. But you see, while the conference sent Elsie to Clarenceville to close down the church, Jesus sent her to open it back up. Elsie worked at the church in the evenings and at weekends while she remained full-time employed in the billing and bookkeeping department of the National Twist Drill and Tool Company in Rochester Hills, a job she kept until 1955. She spent much of her time visiting the neighbors in the neighborhood and making hospital calls. She would gather for Sunday worship every Sunday, and the legend goes that for several weeks nobody came. But she just kept doing what she felt Jesus was asking her to do, loving, serving, and inviting people to start coming to her church. Well, you know how the story goes. Over the next 33 years, Clarenceville United Methodist Church would go from a congregation of 0 members to one of over 1,200. And here's the remarkable thing about Elsie Johns' ministry. The United Methodist Church did not officially recognize women as pastors until 1956. 15 years after Elsie had gone to help breathe life back into a church that everyone else had turned their back on. In fact, at the time of her death, Elsie still had not been fully received as an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. Elsie grew up in a time when the world around her, her community, and even her church told her simply there were things she could not do and things she could not become because she was a woman. It's called a limiting prophecy. It's a word spoken over you that sets a limit on who you are and what you can become. A word that limits what you believe you can do in the world. A limit on what you've come to believe is possible. I imagine every one of us here this morning has had to struggle with a limiting prophecy that has been spoken over us. Maybe they came directly from our parents, or from a teacher, a peer, or indirectly from the norms of your culture. But each of us have had to deal with somebody or something who looked at us and for whatever reason said, "Sorry, you can't do that. Sorry, not for you." Maybe it was because of where you grew up. You know, kids from Rhinelander don't go to Ivy League schools. Maybe it was because of the things that happened to you in the past or the struggles you're having right now. Or maybe it was because, like Elsie Johns, it's because of how you were born. Your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your sexual identity or orientation, that you felt a limiting prophecy spoken over you. The problem with a limiting prophecy is that they stick. And we start to believe them. We internalize them. And these self-limiting prophecies become self-fulfilling prophecies where we begin to speak the same limits over ourselves. Surely I can't do this because I am this. Or I can't do that because I'm that. So you got to ask yourself, where did Elsie Johns get the idea that God recognized her to call and lead when much of the world around her would have denied that call? Where did she get that idea? Where did Elsie Johns hear God say yes when the rest of the world said no? Well, maybe it came from hearing stories like the one that we read in today's scripture. Now, let's just be honest. At first glance, today's text, not much going on. It's kind of cute, it's quaint, it's almost kind of a throwaway text between the action here and the action there, because all we have at first glance is Jesus going to his friend Simon's house. And it says his mother-in-law has a fever. I mean, he wants to do his buddy a solid, right? So he heals his mother-in-law. I mean, anytime you can help your buddy look good in front of his mother-in-law, I mean, that's a good thing to do. Am I right, fellas? I mean, and the mother-in-law, the story says, appreciated the favor so much that she got up and waited on them. I mean, she got up and made them tea and cookies. What a quaint little story. But I'm here today to tell you there is so much more going on in this text. I want to point out 4 things happening in this little story that should open it up in a way that is both meaningful and powerful. First, notice where today's story takes place. It takes place in a home. That is very important. Pay attention in the scripture to any time Jesus is doing something in a home. Homes were the place that the early Jesus movement got its start. And so unlike last week, remember when Jesus encountered so much resistance when he showed up in the synagogue? This week, the very next story, Jesus can freely enact a kingdom mission that he couldn't do in the synagogue just the week before. It's in these home scenes that Jesus demonstrates what it looks like when God's people act like God's people. And what happened in this first scene in the home would have been absolutely radical for Jesus' first century context. Jesus heals a woman. Take note of that. This is the first public healing in the entire gospel. And it is not an accident. Jesus heals a woman. This is a signal right from the beginning that the place of women in the Jesus movement was going to be different from that of the synagogue culture that we just experienced last week. The second thing to consider in today's text is the understanding of the nature of disease and healings in the ancient story. Actually, this is the second and the third thing. Jesus, the story says, Simon's mother-in-law had a fever. Well, and that really means something more to us today in this time that we're living in, doesn't it? But kind of prior to this COVID reality, when we read this story of a fever, it doesn't really match with the level of healings that Jesus has done other times. These illnesses or deformities, even death itself that Jesus heals. So I guess at first glance, this seems like a pretty minor ailment. But the thing to note when reading the gospel stories is that disease was not seen to be an individual sickness or really even a medical concern. Disease in ancient stories like our gospels was understood to be a social dilemma. It was a breakdown of community. Disease in these stories are the manifestation of these limiting prophecies, which means that this woman's fever is a sign of a social illness that devalued women, that didn't see their suffering, their stories, or their gifts, or recognize their leadership. Can you see how this changes the nature of Jesus' healing ministry? From just individual acts of supernatural power to deep acts of solidarity and community restructuring. Jesus not only heals a person, but in doing so seeks to heal the community that was the root cause of the illness in the first place. Right from the very beginning, Jesus seeks to heal the community of faith from the dangerous limiting prophecies that it placed on women. And that even becomes more clear in how the story ends. Remember how the story ends? It said she got up and she began to wait on them. Now, it's really important to remember when we're reading these stories in our Bible that they are translations of translations, of translations of translations. And as the old saying goes, some things get lost in translation. First of all, the word would be better in English than she got up and waited on them. It would be better translated as she began to serve. But it's deeper than that. Much, much deeper than that. The word translated as wait, or better yet, translated as serve, is diakone. That should sound familiar. It's where we get the word deacon, a term for persons set aside for ministry. The word diakone is used only 2 other times in the Gospel of Mark. Once when Jesus refers to himself by saying, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." And later, at the end of the Gospel, we're at the foot of the cross, Jesus points out that the only ones still standing with him are the women who have come to serve. Jesus did not heal this woman so she could cook a meal and clean up after the meeting. No, this healing takes place so this woman can take her place in ministry alongside Jesus and the other disciples. And in healing this limiting prophecy, in healing this woman, Jesus also heals the early church. And beginning to heal the church, Jesus begins to heal the world. And that's what I believed happened to Elsie Johns some 70 years ago. When the world and the church said no, she remembered this story where Jesus said yes. Now, let me be very clear to everyone listening here this morning. Every one of you, every single one of you, man, woman, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, rich, poor, gay, straight, you are called, just like Simon's mother-in-law, just like Elsie Johns, you are called to serve. Let Jesus heal the limiting prophecies that have been placed on you. Let Jesus remind you that you, yes, you, that you are a child of God, that you are wonderfully and fearfully made, that you have been crafted and called for service, and that God needs you. The church needs you. The world needs you to show up and serve. It's so important that we hear God's healing call through the limiting prophecies that have been spoken to us and been spoken over us. And the limiting prophecies we too often speak to ourselves. Can I be honest? Nobody speaks limiting prophecies to Jeff Nelson better than Jeff Nelson speaks them to himself. I need this reminder this morning that God sees through those words that I place on me. And I think that today's word is especially important for this moment we are living in right now because friends, let me just tell you what is obviously so true, that we are living in this moment of history when there have been more limits placed on us than at any other time in our lives. We feel limited on where we can go. We feel limited on what we can do. And because we are limited on where we can go and what we can do, my fear is that we are beginning to internalize that feeling of limiting. And that we are beginning to feel like we aren't needed anymore. That we are not needed by God or by the church or by the world or by each other. And so let me say this morning, there is nothing further from that truth. In fact, your willingness to show up right now with the gifts that God has given you is needed more now than ever. And in some ways, it's easier than ever. Here are just some ways that you can show up right now. You heard Danielle and Bridget to share the love. We want to deliver 100 Valentine's baskets to people who need to be reminded that they still matter. Will you bake some cookies? Will you come to church on the 13th? We'll be outside, masked up, socially distanced. Will you come and assemble the bags? We need some kids. Here's the best story. Roger Boyer called us this week and said, hey, can I make some cards too? You're darn right, Roger. Show up and make some cards. Ain't nothing better than getting a homemade card from your church friends. And we need some people who show up to deliver these, to drop them off at someone's home. Will you show up and help us show the love, share the love? You know, we still feed 35 to 40 hungry people every day. So we still need your help to show up. We need food donations for our lunch program. When you're at the grocery store, would you be willing to pick up a few extra things that can go into a bag of lunch? We need people to still help prepare and serve the meals. We need people to donate men's underwear and long underwear right now. We're living in a time when folks do not have access to laundry underwear. It's like gold. And you know, we are still partnering with our mission partners, so we still need some people to buy produce for the Redford Brightmoor Initiative, and we need people who'd be willing to read books to kids from Ferndale Elementary online, on Zoom. We'll help you figure out the Zoom. We're still helping make birthday parties happen at the Methodist Children's Home for boys that have no other families but the family they find there. Birthdays haven't stopped. One of the easiest things you can do to show up right now is pray for our members. Did you know we send out a weekly prayer list of people that you can pray for and send cards to? If you're not on that list, would you tell God you're willing to serve in that way? We need callers to check in on some of our most isolated folks. We need people who would send cards to college kids. Can you imagine doing college this year? How about a note from your church that says, I'm praying for you? And hey, I'll throw in an upper room just in case you want to remember God's with you. Basically, all I'm trying to say is we just need you to show up with what God gave you. To put aside all of those things that say, I'm too shy and I'm not spiritual enough and I'm too new at this church or I'm too old that I can't help. Could you just let God say he could use you today? Just say, I'm thinking about you. I wonder how you're doing. Is there anything you need? How can I be praying for you? Listen to that story again from Jesus' Gospel of Mark and let God speak through all the limiting prophecies that you have placed on yourself or have let the world place upon you, and realize that all you have to do is be like Simon's mother-in-law and show up and take your place in the great ministry of service to the world. So if you've heard God nudge you today and you're willing to show up, will you give Bridget or Danielle a call and just say, Pastor Jeff said you could use me. Please use me. And we'll find something that you can do to serve. You know, God uses those who show up to serve. Woody Allen once said 90% of life is just showing up. Those who say yes, even when everything inside them and sometimes everything around them says not now, not yet, not ready. God uses those who say, if you can use me, here I am. Don't believe me? Ask this guy. That's right. Our own Pastor Bob. Why ask him? Because guess where Bob went to church when he was growing up? That's right, Clarenceville, United Methodist Church in Livonia, Michigan. And Bob heard the call to serve God in the church and the world from Pastor Elsie Johns, who despite every voice telling her knew that Jesus was still telling her yes. And so Bob figured out he could say yes to the gifts that God had placed on him because he watched this woman say yes to the gift God had placed on her. Jesus sees you. And he says yes. Yes to the gifts you have to show and share with the world. Show up, my friends, ready to serve. And God can use you. Amen.